Europe's great powers built a system meant to prevent catastrophe. Empires armed themselves, signed defensive alliances, and convinced themselves that mutual obligations would make large wars impossible. And yet, one assassination shattered that certainty. When Gavrilo Princip fired 2 pistol shots on a Sarajevo street, the alliances meant to contain violence instead dragged an entire continent into it. The world he entered had been engineered to stop exactly that outcome. Monarchies ruled multi-ethnic empires stretching from the Rhine to the Russian steppe. Diplomats managed rivalries through treaties that promised protection if any member faced attack. Each government trusted the same calculation. No state would risk a war that would trigger them all. At the edge of that system stood a restless province where resentment waited for an opening. Across Europe in the early 20th century, imperial authority looked unshakable. The Austro-Hungarian Empire governed a patchwork of nationalities across Central and Eastern Europe. Germany stood newly unified and militarily confident, and Russia claimed influence over Slavic lands in the Balkans. Diplomats spoke the language of stability, pointing to treaties that linked governments together in defensive commitments. The logic felt reassuring. Alliances discouraged aggression because any conflict would immediately multiply. Behind that confidence lay a rigid structure that locked powers into opposing camps. In 1879, Germany and Austria-Hungary formalized their partnership through the Dual Alliance, pledging military support if Russia threatened either empire. France answered by strengthening its own understanding with Russia, and Britain gradually aligned with both powers through a series of diplomatic agreements. The map of Europe hardened into 2 rival blocs, each government promising that these commitments preserved peace even as armies expanded and railway timetables mapped future mobilizations. In the Balkans, the calculations of empires collided with something far less predictable. Colonel Dragutin Dimitrijević operated inside the Serbian military intelligence service, moving through Belgrade with the reputation of a conspirator who treated political violence as a tool of national strategy. Years earlier, he had participated in the brutal assassination of Serbia's own royal family, and the experience hardened him into a man who trusted secrecy more than diplomacy. Under the code name Apis, he helped guide a clandestine network known as the Black Hand, an organization that smuggled weapons, spread propaganda, and cultivated young nationalists across territories ruled by Austria-Hungary. The Black Hand pursued a simple objective: unite South Slavic lands under Serbian leadership and weaken imperial control in Bosnia. Dimitrijević did not deliver speeches or public manifestos. He moved through quiet rooms, speaking to trusted intermediaries and arranging contacts across the border. Students and activists drifting through Belgrade encountered men who asked careful questions about loyalty and courage. Those who answered convincingly received training in pistols, grenades, and the use of cyanide capsules meant to erase evidence if capture followed. From those circles emerged a handful of young Bosnian conspirators, thin and intense, carrying resentment shaped by years of imperial rule. They studied the mechanics of small bombs and the weight of Browning pistols passed across wooden tables. Each understood the same calculation. One dramatic act could ignite attention far beyond their small movement. Their instructors emphasized discipline, timing, and silence. The target remained undefined for the moment, but the purpose did not. Opportunity arrived in the form of a royal visit. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, scheduled a military inspection in Sarajevo for June 1914. The trip looked routine from Vienna's perspective, a formal appearance meant to demonstrate imperial authority in Bosnia. Local officials organized parades and receptions, while army officers prepared demonstrations for the visiting heir. Yet the date carried a bitter symbolism for many Serbs. 28th June marked the anniversary of the medieval Battle of Kosovo, a moment tied deeply to Serbian national memory. For conspirators searching for a stage, the visit transformed Sarajevo into exactly that. Across the continent, none of Europe's leaders sensed the danger taking shape along that narrow street route. Diplomats trusted their treaties, generals trusted their mobilization plans, and monarchs trusted the balance of power that had held for decades. Each government believed the alliance system guaranteed stability because every rival faced the same risk of escalation. No one imagined a handful of young conspirators could pull the first thread loose. If you're drawn to the moments where small decisions collide with empires, take a second to like the video and subscribe. These stories are not about distant dates or textbooks. They're about individuals making choices inside systems far larger than themselves. And sometimes those choices fracture the systems entirely. The weapons did not travel like contraband in a market cart with a loud escort. They moved as favors, as handshakes, as small parcels passed through men who pretended they were carrying nothing. The assassination team crossed from Serbia into Bosnia in fragments, taking back roads and night crossings where border posts were thin, and the guards could be bribed or simply avoided. Pistols and bombs were wrapped and rewrapped, hidden under clothing and inside ordinary bags, while the young men rehearsed their cover stories until the words came out flat. Every mile that brought them closer to Sarajevo tightened the same risk. One search, one nervous pause, and the whole plot would die in a ditch before it ever reached the Archduke. By the time the last of them slipped into Bosnia, the conspiracy no longer felt like an idea. It felt like a weight they carried in their ribs. They found rooms, contacts, and places to wait, moving through cafes and stairwells with the careful distance of men who could not afford familiarity. They checked the pistols again and again, not because the metal had changed, but because their hands had. Each day they remained undiscovered made them bolder, and each hour before the visit made them more trapped inside the plan they could not reverse. Franz Ferdinand arrived without that kind of fear because the empire had trained him not to live with it. He and Duchess Sophie reached Sarajevo on the eve of the inspection and settled at the Ilija Spa Hotel, a place built for calm, gardens, baths, polite staff, the sense that the province could be managed by ceremony. Officers briefed him, schedules were confirmed, uniforms laid out, and the visit was treated like a performance the state had rehearsed 100 times. In the city, the conspirators heard where he was staying, and the information landed like a door unlocking. The target was not abstract anymore, not a symbol, but a man who would move through specific streets at a specific hour. Morning came on 28th June 1914, with crowds already gathering along the Miljacka River, lining Appel Quay to watch the motorcade pass. The Archduke's cars rolled forward in a neat procession, open-top and slow enough for faces to be seen, as if visibility itself were proof of control. Along the route, multiple assassins took their positions, spaced out like a series of loaded traps, each one told that if the man ahead failed, the next must act without hesitation. They stood with bombs in pockets and pistols under coats, watching the cars come closer, feeling the terrifying clarity of a moment that would not return. The first strike came not as a clean execution, but as a clumsy collision between nerve and timing. Nedeljko Čabrinović stepped out and threw his bomb at the Archduke's car, and for a fraction of a second, it seemed as if the entire empire might be ripped open on the river road. The device bounced off the vehicle and detonated beneath the following car instead, shredding metal and glass and throwing bodies into frantic motion. Smoke rose, officers bled, and the motorcade lurched forward at speed, leaving behind the evidence of attack and the sick fact that the heir was still alive. Čabrinović tried to erase himself the way he'd been instructed, swallowing cyanide and jumping into the river, but neither gesture delivered the clean disappearance he'd imagined. The poison failed to kill him quickly. The water was too shallow to hide him. Hands grabbed him, hauled him out, and beat him as the crowd surged with rage and confusion. The conspirators farther down the route heard the explosion and had to decide in an instant whether the plan was finished or merely damaged. Some froze, some lost their window, and some watched the cars vanish with a brutal awareness that the empire had survived the first blow. At City Hall, Franz Ferdinand's control finally cracked in public. He arrived shaken and furious, his uniform and composure both, strained by the fact that the visit had nearly ended in pieces on the pavement. He confronted local officials with anger that did not bother to hide itself, his voice and posture making it clear that ceremony was now an insult. And then, instead of cancelling the day, he chose to visit the wounded officers in the hospital, a decision meant to display resolve and empathy, and one that immediately scrambled the motorcade's route into something less rehearsed and far more dangerous. Orders were issued quickly, but in fragments, and fragments are how disasters grow. Drivers were told a new destination, a new path, a new urgency, and yet not every man in the chain received the message with the same precision. As the cars left City Hall and began to disperse through Sarajevo's streets, the procession lost its earlier rhythm, splitting and shifting like a herd startled by a gunshot. The city, already tense, became unpredictable, full of corners and pauses where an empire's safety depended on a single correct turn. Near the route, one conspirator did not run, did not surrender, and did not accept that the day was over. Gavrilo Princip remained nearby, still armed, his earlier chance gone but his resolve unspent, watching the confused movement of vehicles and people, as if the city itself might offer him another opening. He stood close enough to hear the mutter of passing men and the clatter of wheels on stone, close enough to smell smoke still drifting from the earlier blast. The first attempt had failed and exposed them, but the Archduke was still moving through Sarajevo, and Princip was still waiting. The driver had been told there was a new plan, but the city did not care about plans. As the motorcade left City Hall and threaded back into Sarajevo's streets, the lead car kept moving. The next followed, and then the Archduke's vehicle made a turn that should never have happened. It swung onto Franz Josef Street, narrowing into a channel of buildings and pedestrians, and for a moment the procession looked less like an imperial statement and more like a confused group trying to find its way out of its own crowd. The mistake did not announce itself with drama. It arrived as ordinary motion going in the wrong direction. An officer shouted, an arm waved, and the car slowed, braking hard enough to shift the passengers and force the engine into a strained idle. The driver hesitated, then tried to correct the error, and the correction required the one thing the conspirators had been denied all morning: time. The Archduke's car began to reverse near the Latin Bridge. Tires scraping against the uneven street, the vehicle briefly trapped between the need to move and the space to do it. People on the sidewalk leaned in, not fully understanding that they were watching a royal life become stationary within arm's reach. Gavrilo Princip was there because he had not left. He had drifted, repositioned, and waited through the chaos after the bomb, still holding the pistol that had become heavier with every passing minute. And now the target rolled toward him as if pulled by the error itself. He stepped forward, cutting through the shallow gap between curb and car, and raised the weapon with a steadiness that did not come from calm so much as from commitment. He fired 2 shots at close range, and the sound was sharp enough to erase the street noise around it. The first bullet struck Franz Ferdinand, tearing into him with the blunt finality of metal meeting flesh. The second hit Duchess Sophie, who had been beside him, and the movement of the car, the people, and the entire morning collapsed into a single frantic point. Guards and bystanders surged, arms reaching, bodies pressing, and Princip was grabbed and struck as men tried to disarm him before he could fire again. In the car, Sophie's body slumped toward her husband, and Franz Ferdinand's hands moved in an instinctive, useless attempt to hold what was already leaving him. The motorcade that had been meant to display authority now became a panicked flight. The driver accelerated not toward ceremony, but toward help, while officers shouted orders that were no longer about protocol, but about surviving the moment. Blood spread across uniforms that had been pressed for photographs, and the air inside the vehicle filled with the copper smell of injury and the desperate rasp of a man trying to breathe through a wound that made breathing a negotiation. Sophie's head fell forward, and Franz Ferdinand's voice faltered as the distance between life and death narrowed into seconds. Outside, the city snapped into a different mood, one where suspicion moved faster than fact. Princip was dragged away, still alive, and the surviving conspirators were hunted down as police and soldiers poured into streets that had just hosted a parade. Some were seized immediately, their faces recognized from earlier positions along the route, while others were found through hurried interrogations and the sudden loosening of tongues under threat. The plot that had depended on silence was now a trail of names, contacts, and desperate denials. News spread across the Austro-Hungarian Empire with a speed that turned rumor into certainty before any investigation could catch up. Telegraph lines carried blunt headlines to Vienna, Budapest, and beyond, and each relay added its own certainty about who must be responsible. For imperial officials, the question was not simply who had pulled the trigger, but what the trigger represented. A local crime in a restless province, or deliberate challenge from Serbia to imperial authority itself. Every answer carried a different consequence, and consequence was now the only language that mattered. In Vienna, the assassination did not land as grief alone. It landed as permission. Officials and advisors gathered with stiff faces and careful phrases, speaking of outrage while their attention moved toward calculation. The empire had been humiliated in public, attacked in a city it claimed to control, and the heir to the throne had been killed in the open street like a common target. As the hours passed, suspicion hardened into conviction, and conviction pointed across the border toward Serbia, where nationalist agitation had long been blamed for the Balkans' instability. The debate inside the imperial government tightened around retaliation, and retaliation immediately raised a larger fear. Austria-Hungary could not strike Serbia hard without risking Russian reaction. That fear did not slow the push for action. It redirected it toward the one partner Vienna believed could shield the empire from consequences. Austro-Hungarian leaders turned to Germany, not simply for sympathy, but for backing that would make their next move possible. In the aftermath of 2 gunshots, the crisis stopped being about Sarajevo's street corner and started becoming about who would stand with whom when the answers were demanded. In Berlin, the assassination arrived as an opportunity wrapped in outrage, and Kaiser Wilhelm II received it with the reflex of a man who preferred decisive gestures to careful restraint. Austria-Hungary's representatives came looking for reassurance, and what they got was more than reassurance. It was a sweeping promise that Germany would stand behind Vienna no matter what it chose to do. The words did not come as a formal treaty, written in careful clauses, but as a signal that mattered more than paper. A blank check. With it, Austria-Hungary could stop worrying about being left alone if the Balkans ignited, because the strongest military power in Central Europe had just declared that it would not flinch. That promise shifted the crisis immediately, even before a single order was written. In Vienna, officials who had hesitated now leaned forward, speaking with a confidence that came from borrowed strength. They had lost their air in public, been mocked by a provincial attack, and now they possessed what they believed was the cure: German support and the right moment to use it. The question stopped being whether to punish Serbia and became how hard to strike without giving anyone time to interfere. War advocates inside the Austro-Hungarian leadership pushed their case with cold urgency. They argued that Serbia was not simply an irritant, but the infection eating away at imperial authority in the Balkans, feeding nationalist movements that threatened to pull provinces out of the empire piece by piece. If Vienna responded weakly, they said, it would invite further challenges, more assassinations, more open defiance. If Vienna responded brutally, it could crush the idea that a small state could humiliate a great empire and live. Others warned that brutality would not stay local because Russia watched Serbia like a client and a cause. Those warnings did not stop the momentum. They sharpened it into a demand for speed and control. If Austria-Hungary acted fast, it could present Europe with a fait accompli, forcing other powers to react to a new reality rather than shape it. The empire needed a move that looked like diplomacy while functioning like a trap. So they drafted an ultimatum designed to corner Serbia, not persuade it. The demands went beyond apologies and punishment of individuals. They required Serbia to suppress nationalist networks, silence propaganda, purge certain officials, and, most explosively, allow Austro-Hungarian representatives to participate in investigations and enforcement inside Serbian territory. It was a document written with the language of legal order and the intention of humiliation, because accepting it fully would make Serbia look less like a sovereign state and more like a province being disciplined. Vienna's officials worked the clauses like weapons, tightening phrasing until refusal would feel inevitable. Each line carried a calculated insult, each requirement framed as reasonable on the paper, while being politically poisonous in practice. The ultimatum did not aim to uncover truth about Sarajevo. It aimed to create a moment where Austria-Hungary could claim it had tried peace and been rejected. With German backing in their pocket, the writers did not need Serbia to comply. They needed Serbia to stumble. On July 23, 1914, the ultimatum was delivered to Serbia with a strict deadline that turned diplomacy into a countdown. Serbian officials read it under the pressure of hours, not weeks, with Europe watching through the thin veil of embassies and telegrams. The demand for speed was itself a form of force because it limited consultation and narrowed options to panic and instinct. Every minute that passed without an answer made Vienna's next step easier to justify. Serbia responded by accepting most of the demands, conceding more than any proud government wanted to concede under threat. They promised to suppress propaganda, arrest those implicated, and cooperate in ways that signaled desperation to avoid war. But when they reached the clauses that cut directly into sovereignty, allowing Austro-Hungarian agents to operate inside Serbia, they drew the line and offered alternatives instead. It was not a defiant rejection. It was a careful refusal meant to preserve the appearance of independence while still begging for a way out. For Vienna, that careful refusal was enough. It did not matter how much Serbia had accepted, because the ultimatum had been constructed to make one rejection outweigh every concession. The empire now held a document it could point to as proof that Serbia would not submit, and behind that proof stood Germany's promise that Vienna would not face the consequences alone. The deadline had run, the trap had closed, and the crisis moved from writing to action. In St. Petersburg, the crisis did not look like a distant Balkan quarrel. It looked like a test of Russian credibility. Ministers and generals argued inside rooms heavy with cigarette smoke and summer heat, measuring Serbia's value in influence and humiliation rather than sentiment. If Russia abandoned Serbia, it would signal weakness to Austria-Hungary, to Germany, and to every small state that clung to Russian protection in the region. If Russia intervened too openly, it risked triggering the very war its leaders claimed to fear, because everyone in Europe knew what Russian movement meant for German planning. The Tsar's government tried to hold both positions at once, speaking of peace while preparing for pressure. Advisors pressed for caution, insisting that the empire was not ready for a continental war and that mobilization could not be treated like a diplomatic gesture. Others insisted the opposite, warning that caution would be read as surrender, and that Serbia's destruction would leave Russia isolated in the Balkans. Every argument, even the cautious ones, circled the same problem. Russia could not threaten force without being ready to use it. Once the decision shifted from words to railways, events began moving on their own. Orders went out for large-scale mobilization, and mobilization was not a symbolic act that could be reversed with a polite telegram. It meant reservists called from farms and factories, uniforms issued, rifles counted, and trains scheduled down to the hour. Stations filled with men carrying bundles and confusion, and officers looked at timetables with the focus of people who knew a delay could kill more surely than a bullet. In the eyes of Europe's other powers, Russia had not simply chosen to support Serbia. It had chosen to set the machinery of war in motion. Berlin reacted with alarm that hardened immediately into threat. Germany's leaders viewed Russian mobilization as the opening move of a larger encirclement, the nightmare they had planned against for years. They sent ultimatums demanding Russia halt the process, and the demands were delivered with the tone of a clock being wound, not a discussion being offered. At the same time, Germany pressed France, demanding a declaration of neutrality that would split the Franco-Russian partnership and allow Berlin to act without fear of a two-front war. The ultimatums were written like legal documents, but carried the emotional weight of panic. Russia could not easily stop mobilization once it was rolling, because stopping it would expose weakness at home and invite diplomatic humiliation abroad. France could not declare neutrality without dissolving its alliances and accepting the possibility of German domination. The responses did not arrive fast enough to satisfy Germany's timetable, and Germany's timetable did not care what anyone wanted. When Germany's ultimatum expired, declarations replaced demands. Germany declared war on Russia, and the crisis crossed the line that diplomats had spent a month pretending was still distant. Telegrams that had once carried cautious phrases now carried irreversible facts. Mobilization schedules became marching orders, and the language of responsibility became the language of enemies. One decision, framed as a defensive necessity, now required every other decision that would follow it. France moved with the grim discipline of an ally that could see the trap closing. Its army mobilized as the alliance system locked Europe into opposing camps, and trains began pulling men toward the frontiers with the dull efficiency of a nation that had planned for this scenario in every detail. Politicians spoke of restraint while approving measures that made restraint impossible, because if France waited too long, it would be struck unprepared. The alliances that had been sold as safeguards now behaved like chains, and with Germany and Russia at war, the continent's remaining choices narrowed into a brutal binary: enter the conflict now on your own terms, or be dragged into it later on someone else's. Germany's war plan was built for speed, and once speed became the priority, diplomacy became a nuisance to be swept aside. Berlin declared war on France, turning what had been a crisis of telegrams into a crisis of borders, and the decision carried the hard logic of a German staff work. If Russia was mobilizing in the east, France could not be allowed time to mobilize in the west. Orders rippled through headquarters and rail depots, and the army moved with the practiced certainty of a machine that had rehearsed this day in schedules and ink. To make that machine work, Germany needed a route, and the route ran through Belgium. German armies crossed into Belgian territory to execute the Schlieffen Plan, not because Belgium was the enemy in any ideological sense, but because geography made Belgian neutrality inconvenient. Columns of infantry and artillery rolled toward the border with the blunt confidence of a state that believed necessity excused everything, and officers delivered demands and warnings to Belgian officials who knew what refusal would mean. The invasion was an irreversible act, a violation written into Europe's diplomatic fabric, and once it happened, every other government had to decide whether treaties still mattered or whether power had replaced them entirely. Belgium resisted, and resistance turned the invasion into a spectacle of force. towns faced the sudden presence of foreign troops, roads filled with refugees carrying what they could, and Belgian units fought where they could slow the advance, knowing they could not stop it. The Belgian government appealed to Britain for protection, invoking the promise that its neutrality would be defended, and the appeal was not poetic. It was legal, urgent, and backed by the visible fact of German soldiers marching across Belgian soil. In London, the question of war became a question of obligation and credibility. Ministers argued over whether Britain's interests truly required intervention, and whether staying out would preserve the empire or expose it to a future German-dominated continent. Yet the German invasion made neutrality harder to justify, because it turned treaty guarantees into a public test that Britain could not quietly ignore. If Britain accepted the violation of Belgium, it would accept that treaties were theater, and that acceptance would echo far beyond Europe into every corner of the empire that relied on British promises. Britain issued an ultimatum demanding Germany withdraw from Belgium, and the demand was framed as restraint, even as it carried the weight of threat. German leaders did not treat it as a serious negotiation. To halt the advance would ruin the war plan they believed was their only chance of victory, and the army was already moving too deeply to be easily stopped. While diplomats exchanged final messages, soldiers continued crossing rivers and roads, and the space for backing down narrowed with every mile gained. When Tibet, Germany did not comply. Britain declared war, and the last pretense of a contained conflict evaporated. A continental crisis now included the world's largest maritime empire, and the scope of the war expanded in a single announcement that sounded almost procedural. The alliance system had fully activated, and the logic that had once promised peace now delivered the opposite. Obligations triggered by fear, fear turning into movement, movement turning into declarations, declarations turning into slaughter. Europe had been locked into total war, not by one leader's desire for apocalypse, but by a chain of decisions each government claimed it could not avoid. Mobilization did not arrive as a single dramatic moment. It arrived as a million private ruptures happening at once. Orders pinned to town notice boards pulled men away from fields, workshops, and offices, and the same faces that had argued politics in cafes now stood in lines for uniforms and rifles. Railway stations became choke points of noise and exhaustion, packed with soldiers carrying bread, letters, and awkward confidence, while officers shouted names over the steam and crowding. Europe's governments told their populations that the war would be short, because short wars are easier to sell, and because no leader wanted to admit how little control they still had. The first battle punished that illusion immediately. Armies surged forward expecting decisive breakthroughs and instead found machine gun fire, entrenched positions, and the brutal mathematics of modern artillery. Columns that had marched in bright discipline scattered under shell bursts that tore the ground into choking mud and smoke, and men learned in minutes what planners had refused to imagine for years. The early fighting failed to deliver quick victories, not because soldiers lacked courage, but because courage did not matter against industrial killing. As casualties mounted, governments tightened their grip rather than loosen it. Ministries demanded more shells, more rifles, more men, and economies began reshaping themselves around the needs of the front. Factories retooled, rationing spread, and propaganda flooded streets and newspapers, promising meaning where there was only consumption. Entire populations were drafted into the war's machinery, whether through labor, taxes, food control, or silence, and the state's demands expanded until private life felt like a resource to be requisitioned. The longer the war continued, the more fragile Europe's imperial systems became, because empires survive on legitimacy as much as force. When fathers did not return, when wages lagged, behind prices, when shortages tightened into hunger, obedience began to look less like loyalty and more like habit under strain. Governments that had once argued about diplomacy now argued about bread and strikes, watching fear spread through cities that had never heard artillery, but still felt the war in empty shelves and crowded hospitals. The power that empires projected abroad began bleeding away at home, and the people who had been told they were defending civilization started demanding to know what civilization was costing them. Across the continent, observers could see the shape of the disaster, even if officials refused to say it aloud. Newspapers tried to maintain confidence, but the tone of certainty cracked in the details. Lists of dead, appeals for donations, warnings against defeatism, the sudden presence of amputees in train stations and parks. Neutral states watched their borders tighten and their markets distort, realizing the conflict was rewriting trade routes, alliances, and expectations. The assassination crisis that had been framed as a Balkan punishment had detonated into something that no cabinet could manage, because it was no longer a decision. It was a condition. The war spread beyond Europe because the empires fighting in Europe were global by design. Colonial troops were recruited, coerced, and shipped across oceans to die in places they had never heard of, while distant ports and railways became strategic assets to be seized or defended. Naval blockades turned food into a weapon, and overseas possessions became bargaining chips and battlegrounds. What began with gunshots in Sarajevo now pulled continents into its gravity, and the political order of Europe started unraveling not in one collapse, but in a grinding, expanding crisis that demanded more and more until there was nothing left to give. Years of total war did not merely kill soldiers. It hollowed out the states that sent them. Armies were drained and rebuilt until experience became a scarce resource. Economies were strained until money meant less than food, and governments tightened controls until they resembled sieges against their own populations. The imperial promise, order, stability, protection, began collapsing under the visible evidence of exhaustion. Ration lines, strikes, inflation, and a steady flow of wounded men who returned with missing limbs and missing faith. No empire could keep demanding sacrifice forever without being forced to answer what it was sacrificing for. As the pressure rose, cracks spread into revolutions, defeats, and political upheaval that traveled faster than generals could respond. Russia, bled by losses and shortages, watched authority slip away from the Tsar's government as unrest swelled into open revolt, then hardened into a new regime willing to abandon the war rather than be destroyed by it. Austria-Hungary's internal tensions, held together by dynastic habit and police force, began pulling apart as national groups demanded exits from an empire that could no longer protect them. Germany, starving under blockade and grinding casualties, saw discipline fractures into mutinies, street violence, and a public mood that no longer feared the old order enough to obey it. By 1918, the collapses came in rapid succession, as if the war had simply waited until the moment multiple supports failed at once. The Russian Empire fell first, and its fall signaled to every exhausted population that a monarchy could be broken. The German Empire followed, its leadership forced out as military defeat and domestic revolt converged. Austria-Hungary disintegrated into separate national states. The imperial center, unable to command loyalty or even define what the empire still was. The Ottoman Empire, already strained, fractured under military defeats and internal pressures, and the map of Europe and its surrounding regions began rearranging itself with ruthless speed. In the aftermath, historians could trace the chain of decisions backward through mobilizations and ultimatums, through the blank check and the Serbian reply, back to Sarajevo and the July crisis that followed the assassination. The trail did not read like a single conspiracy because it was not one. It read like a sequence of governments choosing escalation over retreat because retreat looked like weakness. Each step had been defended as necessary, and each necessity had narrowed the next choice, until war became less a decision than a condition imposed by momentum. The men who believed they were controlling events spent the war proving that their control had been an illusion. The gunshots in Sarajevo stand as the moment when Europe's carefully balanced imperial order began its irreversible collapse. A regional assassination carried out by a young man with a pistol and a plan that should have died in the street forced empires to choose pride over restraint and speed over caution. Alliances that had been sold as barriers against war became rails guiding governments toward it, and once the train started moving, stopping became politically impossible. The world that emerged after 1918 was not a repaired version of 1914 because the old order had not been wounded. It had been dismantled, piece by piece, by leaders who insisted at every step that they still had things under control.